She wasn't supposed to still be alive, and yet she was. A breathless whisper of a creature caught in the merciless grip of metal and snow. Her leg was twisted inside a rusted steel trap, the jagged jaws cutting into bone, her fur slick with blood and the melt of ice, but she didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She simply lay there, hollow-eyed and still, as the men approached with bolt cutters and gloved hands. Her body had gone beyond pain, beyond fear, like her soul had receded deep into some unreachable sanctuary where no more agony could find her. 2 days, that's how long she had lain there, no food. No fight left. One of the rescuers whispered, "We almost sedated her just to end her suffering." But something held them back. Maybe it was the way her eyes didn't blink. Maybe it was the ghost of something sacred still buried in her silence. So, instead, they freed her from the trap, lifted her gently into a crate, and carried her away toward a wildlife rehabilitation center just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico. They called her Savannah, not because she looked like she belonged to a sunlit grassland. No, then she looked like ruin. Her fur was matted with blood, her breath shallow, ribs sharp under her skin. But they gave her that name like a prayer, like a second chance waiting on the edge of hope. And sometimes that's all a soul needs. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. She didn't want their hope, not then. Savannah wasn't grateful, she wasn't curious. She was a storm locked in a cage. The first days were filled with nothing but fury, blind, ragged fury. She hurled herself against the steel walls of her enclosure, again and again, tearing open her stitches, reopening every fresh scar. They watched her through cameras, too afraid to enter. She didn't growl at the humans, she growled at shadows. At the wind. At herself. Her eyes remained open, but they were unseeing, lost in some distant world. A place where cages didn't exist and betrayal didn't smell like antiseptic. Then on the 5th day, something changed, or rather something vanished. Savannah lay down in the farthest, coldest corner of her pen and simply stopped. She stopped drinking, stopped eating, refused even painkillers. Flies gathered on her muzzle, and she didn't move. The wildness hadn't left her. But something deeper had broken, not her body, but her will. The team tiptoed around her enclosure, their voices hushed, their eyes heavy with a truth they couldn't speak aloud. This wasn't a bobcat healing, this was a creature grieving. She had not just been hurt, she had been betrayed by life itself. And now she was choosing to vanish slowly. Sometimes the wild chooses silence over survival. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Then came the unexpected. A crate arrived from Texas, unplanned, urgent. Inside was another feline, not a native. Not a survivor of these woods, but a child. A trembling, silent child. He was no bigger than a house cat, belly scarred with healing burns, fur thin in patches. He didn't hiss. He didn't growl. He just made a sound, a tiny, formless cry like a question whispered into emptiness. His name was Kaio, they found. The name on paperwork discovered during a raid outside Austin, Texas. Kaio had been smuggled in a duffel bag across the border, sold online as a luxury pet. When authorities found him, he was curled up in a closet, shaking and starving, wrapped in a child's blanket like a discarded toy. He was barely 12 weeks old, a baby who should have been nursing under his mother's watchful eyes. Instead, he was abandoned by humanity, scarred by greed. Sanctuaries couldn't take him, zoos refused. He was too broken, too illegal, too inconvenient. Only the Wildlife Center in Santa Fe said yes, even if only temporarily. His enclosure was set. Across from Savannah's, not close enough for contact, just close enough for presence. She hadn't moved in days. But the moment they placed Kaio down on the warm bedding, Savannah's head turned. Just slightly. The cameras caught it, the first flicker of recognition. Her ears twitched toward his sound. He cried again that night, and this time Savannah stood. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. She didn't attack, didn't slam her body into walls. Savannah rose like an old wound remembering how to breathe. Slow, shaky, deliberate. She stood facing the direction of the cub's pen and stayed there. 5 minutes, 10, motionless, and the next morning something miraculous happened. She ate. Not much, just a few slivers of rabbit meat. But for a creature who had starved herself to the edge of death, it was enough to make the staff gasp aloud. They rushed to the cameras, speechless. She kept her eyes on Kaio's pen the entire time. Kaio couldn't see her yet. He was too weak, too busy surviving, but Savannah knew. She felt the presence of another soul nearby, one that, like hers, didn't belong. One that, like hers, had been broken by the cruelty of humans, and something stirred. A flicker of wild understanding. The beginning of a bond neither of them asked for, but both somehow needed. And though they had never touched, never spoken, something ancient and sacred had begun to awaken between them. Two are better than one. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. The team didn't believe it at first. We watched the footage 3 times. Savannah, who had been unreachable, mentally gone in that tragic way animals sometimes leave without dying, was moving, not out of instinct. Not out of pain, but out of something more fragile, curiosity. Compassion, hope. She watched Kaio like a sentinel, alert, silent, unmoving. There were no snarls, no lunges. Just that long, haunting gaze, not affection, not hostility, something in between. "She's aware," a volunteer whispered, eyes fixed on the screen. "But I don't know what that means yet." Kaio remained. In his little world, the glow of a heat lamp, the taste of milk from a bottle, the soft towel where he buried himself like a memory. He hadn't seen her yet, but 2 days later he stood for the first time, wobbly, small, brave. He walked, stumbling, toward the edge of his enclosure, sniffed the bars. Looked out, and there she was. Savannah didn't move. Kaio sat down before the glass divider and stayed. They stared at each other for what felt like hours. Deep calls to deep in the roar of your waterfalls. All your waves and breakers have swept over me. Kaio lifted a tiny paw, reached through the low gap near the floor. Not far enough to touch. Just enough to try. Savannah's ears pinned back. Her tail twitched. A growl rumbled low in her throat. Uncertain, guttural, not quite threat, but not quite trust. The staff froze, but she didn't lunge, didn't retreat. She stood there still, every muscle tight, her breath fast but even. Kaio yawned, a small, innocent gesture, and Savannah flinched. One paw rose as if to strike, then slowly lowered. It wasn't peace, it wasn't love. It was something more dangerous, the beginning of surrender. The start of choosing connection over isolation. The staff set strict rules, no contact, no shared sessions. But they allowed the enclosures to remain side by side, monitored constantly, escape panels ready. That night, Savannah didn't sleep. In the far corner, she slept beside the divider. The next morning, Kaio pressed his nose against the seam between their spaces. Savannah growled again, louder, more certain. But still, she didn't move away. They were separated by glass, by rules, by species, by trauma. But their wounds spoke the same language. A bond born not of comfort, but survival. And that is how healing begins. Where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there I am with them. She watched him like the stars once watched the night, silent, steady, distant, yet drawn. Kaio, the fragile leopard cub with his tender burns and unsure steps, had become the only thing Savannah hadn't turned away from. All day she lay near the divider that separated them, her eyes never leaving his tiny form. The cub would nap. In twitching spells stretch his still healing limbs, roll with the awkward weight of youth, whimper in dreams that only creatures abandoned too young could understand. And through it all Savannah stayed, not out of instinct. Not yet out of comfort, but it wasn't nothing. And for a wild creature who had lost her body to steel traps, her freedom to human hands and her will to grief, even not nothing, was everything. The volunteers stopped whispering the word hopeless. Because while no one dared to name what was growing between the wounded bobcat and the orphan leopard cub, everyone could feel it. Something ancient, something unseen, something That made them all pause. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, to bind up the brokenhearted. Kaio was healing. Not fast, not miraculously, but unmistakably. His frame remained small, his body still trembled with a wobble that made even trained veterinarians hold their breath every time he moved. But there was a new light in his eyes. Now, a steady flame where before there had only been dull survival, he began to play. Not the wild flurry of a jungle-born cub, but gentle, deliberate play, soft swats at his blanket, clumsy rolls across his bedding, tiny pounces at a plastic ring. And every time, after a little motion, he would glance up toward the divider, as if to check, "Are you still there? Are you watching me?" Savannah always was. She no longer growled, no longer bristled at the sound of movement. Her posture had softened, no longer defensive, no longer pressed against the walls of trauma. She lay near the barrier with her head lowered, ears tilted gently forward, her breathing a slow and even tide. Something inside her was stirring, uncoiling. From the tight knot it had been clenched into for so long, even the wilderness and desert will rejoice. They will blossom with joy and singing. The staff didn't call it healing. They didn't want to jinx it, didn't want to paint it into a pretty picture before it was real. But they watched closely now. They noticed Savannah's stillness, how it shifted whenever Kaio was near, how her food bowl was consistently empty each morning, how her wound, still raw, no longer oozed blood from self-inflicted rage. They didn't speak the change aloud, but they felt it like a hush in the air before a sacred moment. Then came the procedure. Kaio's injuries required attention. His burns needed fresh dressings, hydration, and a careful session of wound therapy. It wasn't his first medical outing. But this time was different. This time he was awake. This time he had someone to leave behind. When the vet lifted him gently into a carrier, Kaio cried out. Not in pain, not in fear, but in protest. The sound sliced the air like a blade, and Savannah broke. She leapt to her feet with a force that startled the staff, rushed to the divider, pressed her nose against the seam, pacing, tail lashing, eyes wide with something raw and trembling. By the time Kaio disappeared down the hallway, Savannah had retreated again. Not to rest, but to hide. When the righteous cry for help, the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. It was like watching a fragile bridge collapse. All the delicate progress they had quietly celebrated vanished. Savannah refused to eat, refused to rise. When staff approached, she turned her face toward the wall like the world itself no longer deserved her gaze. Her breathing grew sharp and shallow, her paw twitched. Her ears flattened at every echo in the hallway. This wasn't fear, not the wild kind that drives animals into frantic motion. This was unease, a deeper, quieter fracture, like something sacred had gone missing, a thread, a tether, a presence. Kaio returned hours later, drowsy but safe. The smell of antiseptic clung to his fur. He didn't play that night. Just curled into himself, paws tucked under his chin, tail shielding his nose, and slept. Savannah watched him, her body still. Then, slowly, like something melting, she moved forward. Not to touch, just to be close? Close enough for her breath to fog the glass between them. Close enough to say, "I'm here." She didn't look at him, but she didn't leave. Whatever had begun was still alive. Just quiet, waiting. Be still and know that I am God. Time drifted like snow outside their enclosures, silent, slow, sacred. Kaio grew steadier. His walk no longer trembled with every step. His fur began to fill in, the burns vanishing beneath the soft promise of new gold. He played more often. Now, clumsy pounces, curious growls, joyful swats at leaves the wind carried in. But always, no matter what he did, he returned to the divider. That narrow seam of plexiglass had become his anchor, his world's edge. After every nap, after every meal, he came back. He leaned into that transparent boundary as if waiting for her to meet him, and she did. At first, Savannah lay a few feet away, not close enough for contact, not far enough for indifference. Over time, that distance closed. No fanfare. Dramatic moment. Just morning after morning, inch by inch, her stillness moving closer to his. Until one day, Kaio reached his paw through the lowest slat. Savannah didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She leaned forward, slow, deliberate, her nose hovering just above his outstretched paw. She sniffed, sat still, then laid down, this time, with her body pressed against the divider. Their first touch wasn't skin to fur, but it was something deeper, presence, trust, a surrender neither of them had language for. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. The staff didn't speak. They didn't need to. They stayed longer, by the observation window, eyes wide with quiet wonder. Kaio began to vocalize more often, small chuffs, soft murmurs, sounds not meant for solitude but for someone else. The way a cub calls for a mother, for a sibling, for the heartbeat they once fell asleep beside. Savannah heard. She didn't reply, not with voice, not with sound, but she stayed near. She didn't flinch anymore when he moved, didn't brace when he made noise. Whatever had once shattered inside her, it was shifting, not healed. Not gone, but softening. Healing not like a wound closing shut, but like ice learning to melt. Her eyes were different now. They didn't look past things. They followed him. She mirrored him unknowingly. When he played, she watched. When he slept, she curled in the same direction, her breathing syncing with his like a silent lullaby. The volunteers whispered, "He thinks she's his mother." But even that wasn't the whole story. Because Kaio wasn't the only one healing, and I will restore to you the years that the locust hath eaten. Savannah moved more now. She no longer paced in panic, but explored the edges of her enclosure with curiosity. She ate more steadily. Accepted brief, gentle treatments from the staff. Her growls had vanished, not just at the wind or the world, but at herself. It was as if this tiny, broken cub had stitched something back together in her thread by trembling thread. And no one could explain it, no medicine had done it, no human could have forced it. But Kaio's presence, his voice, his reaching paw through a narrow slat, had become her salvation. She wasn't whole, not yet, but she was no longer broken, beyond reach. And sometimes that is the greatest miracle of all. Out of the wilderness he brings forth springs of living water. But she was no longer empty. That gaping hollowness, the kind that no antibiotic could reach, no enclosure could contain, no soft-spoken vet could soothe, had been quietly filling with something wild and sacred, not healing, not entirely, but hope. And the strange miracle was that it had come not from medicine or man, but from a wounded, foreign cub with scorched fur and trembling paws. Kaio, the tiny leopard who should have died in the dark of a closet, had given Savannah something she hadn't had since. Her leg was stolen by steel, a reason to stay. The first time he fell asleep pressed against the divider, she had every opportunity to move. She was awake when he curled against the seam, his breath small and shallow. His spine rising and falling like a wave too fragile to break, he nestled into the cold glass like it was her warmth, like it meant safety, like he trusted, somehow, that she'd still be there when he woke. And she didn't leave. The night passed in silence, the cameras recording what looked like a prayer in flesh, two spotted silhouettes, one large, one small, laying in mirrored stillness just inches apart, separated by barriers only humans could. Name: God places the lonely in families. He sets the prisoners free and gives them joy. Morning came soft and silver. Kaio stirred first. He blinked, slow and sleepy, then let out a rasp. Not a cry, not a whimper, but something in between. Something meant only for her. Savannah blinked back. And then, as if remembering her own name for the first time, she stretched, her back arched, deliberate. Each paw moved with thought. She walked the perimeter, not in panic or pacing, but in presence, alive, alert. Kaio followed from the side, his tiny feet mimicking her steps like a clumsy echo. Wherever she went, he mirrored her, as if in that ritual he could understand what survival looked like. He wasn't graceful, not yet, but he tried. And something in his trying made someone behind the observation window laugh aloud, a sound no one had made in weeks. "She's teaching him," one whispered, then paused. "Or maybe..." Maybe. He's reminding her how to live. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The center's team met that day, quietly, carefully. They began planning something previously unthinkable. Supervised sessions. The risks were obvious. Savannah, though changed, was still a wild bobcat. Kaio was a fragile, foreign cub with no evolutionary reason to bond with her. But instincts don't ask for permission. And Savannah's instincts had begun to shift. The first session was short, 10 minutes. The enclosure was neutral ground, lined with escape options for both. Kaio was placed in first. He sat, blinking, body small and still. Savannah was released second. She moved like mist, low, slow, cautious. Everyone held their breath. But she didn't pounce. Didn't freeze. She walked directly to him, sniffed. The air above his head then stood still, just over him. And then she lay down. He climbed onto her side like a child coming home, pressing his tiny head into her ribs, his entire body soft with trust. No one moved. No one breathed. Because in that instant, it became impossible to say who needed the other more. Kaio, who had never known the warmth of a mother, and Savannah, who had forgotten what it felt like to be needed. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. And so the sessions grew longer. Not rushed, not scripted, just allowed. They played sometimes. Kaio would chase her tail. She let him. He crawled beneath her chest during naps. She let him stay. And whenever a staff member approached too fast, Savannah rose, not in aggression, but in presence. A shield. A wall. A mother. She stood in front of him without sound, a sentinel made of instinct and love. In protecting him, she began to rebuild herself, not as prey, not as a victim, not even as a patient, but as something fierce, something alive. Then came the winter morning when everything was tested. It was quiet, too quiet. A new arrival had been delivered overnight, a younger bobcat, barely sedated, confused. Placed temporarily in a holding pen beside the outdoor enclosure where Savannah and Kaio had begun their joint sessions. It was supposed to be routine, but something went wrong. The gate hadn't latched fully. Not open, but not closed tight either. And Kaio, curious and unaware, padded toward the fence line, nose twitching. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you. The scent was different, sharp, malevolent. The new bobcat lunged toward the barrier with a growl that cracked the morning open like thunder. Kaio froze, too small to understand, too young to fight. He lowered his body to the ground, unsure. And that's when Savannah moved, not like a victim, not like prey. She rose like fire, like memory, like fury remembered, her back arched. Her fur stood on end. A low, guttural sound poured from her throat, not fear, not threat, but promise. She stepped in front of Kaio, her frame a wall of muscle and wild resolve. He pressed against her back leg and she didn't look down. She didn't need to. She never broke her stare, never wavered. Her entire body said what no human could: you will not touch him. The staff rushed to seal the gate, move the newcomer. The threat passed quickly. But the meaning lingered like a sacred vow. Later, when Kaio curled into her side, breath slow and peaceful, a volunteer whispered. She wasn't reacting. She was protecting. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. They all saw it. Savannah, who hadn't defended herself when caught in steel, who had lain still as pain swallowed her whole, now she stood, not for herself, but for him. From that day on, everything deepened. Kaio's play grew bolder. He leapt at shadows, pounced on feathers, darted across logs. But always he returned to her. And she, once frozen in her own despair, welcomed him with stillness, with shelter. He began to vocalize in gentle murmurs, sounds made for mothers. Savannah listened. And then one day she licked between his ears. Just once, a single rough swipe of her tongue, as if testing the memory of a forgotten role, but she did it again and again, until it became ritual. Each nap ended the same, him beneath her chin, her tongue trailing along his back in slow, soothing circles. The staff no longer whispered theories, they watched in reverent silence. What stood before them wasn't a recovery. It was a resurrection. A wild heart stitched back together by the weight of being needed. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. That weak snow fell, light at first, then thick and soft. It dusted the outdoor enclosure. In white. The world turned quiet, but Savannah and Kaio didn't seem to notice. They had built something no storm could reach. Every morning began the same. Kaio woke first, blinked into the winter air, turned, and she was there, always facing him. He would climb onto her front paws, curl beneath her chin, and she would remain still, warm, eternal. Staff extended their sessions, removed the barriers for longer stretches. But even when freedom was offered, neither strayed far. They chose each other, not out of convenience, not out of chance, but out of something only animals can understand, and only the most broken can feel. A bond not born of blood, but of survival, of presence, of choosing each other when the world had given them nothing else. For I know the plans I have for you. Plans to give you a future and a hope. 10 minutes became 20, then an hour, then entire afternoons. In the shadow of chain-link fences and under the watch of tired cameras, Savannah and Kaio moved without barriers, supervised, monitored, yes, but no longer separate. They shared the same air, the same sun, the same silence. It didn't matter. If they played or rested or simply sat close without touching, it was how they existed together. Kaio, once trembling and hollowed by trauma, now walked with quiet confidence. The kind of confidence only love can teach. If startled, he knew. Longer scattered like leaves in wind, he ran toward her. If tired, he didn't curl into corners, he curled into her. And Savannah. She was no longer the ghost they had carried in from the forest. She had returned to her body. She groomed herself. She ate with purpose. She approached caretakers without flinching. The limp in her front leg no longer marked her as broken, it marked her as undefeated. They didn't need interpretation, the bond was obvious, it pulsed in every glance, every mirrored breath. Every time Kaio blinked from within the safety of her fur, and she blinked back like a heartbeat answering its echo. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives. One quiet afternoon, Kaio was sleeping in the cradle of her body when a technician entered to adjust the heat panel. The noise was minor, barely audible, but Kaio stirred. His head jerked, Savannah rose immediately. Not in aggression, not in panic, but in protection. Her body shifted, blocking his view. Her ears pinned back, her eyes locked on the door. The tech froze mid-step and slowly backed out. "She's his," someone whispered outside. 3 words. Simple? True. That evening, something rare happened. Savannah began to play. Not like Kaio, no tumbling, no clumsy chases. But she swatted lightly at a pine bark sliver, rolled it toward him. A gesture, an invitation. Kaio pounced with joy. His eyes wide with the kind of awe only the very young carry. He had filled something inside her. Not with noise or dependence, but with meaning. And she, in turn, had become his entire world. 2 wild hearts from different lands, different species, different wounds, but pain recognizes pain. And love, when it arrives without warning, knows where to make its home. Deep calls unto deep. In the roar of your waterfalls, all your waves and breakers have swept over me. Then came the knock. Routine inspection, they said. Officials from the State Wildlife Board, clipboards in hand, voices calm but cold. It began with the usual. Protocol checks, permit reviews, animal condition reports. Nothing out of place until the questions shifted. Why are a bobcat and a leopard cub housed together? Is there a formal behavioral clearance for cross-species interaction? Do you understand this could be a violation of containment policy? The room stilled. The staff tried to explain about Savannah's collapse, Kaio's trauma, how their recovery began with each other, not before, that this wasn't about protocol. This was about survival, emotion, healing, but rules do not listen. Rules do. Not watch breathless over monitor screens at 2 a.m. Rules do not hear small cubs call out in the dark or see ghosts return to their bodies because they've been needed by something smaller than themselves. The officials heard the words, but not the meaning. We'll need to review this, one said. You may need to separate them until a decision is made, the team nodded. But inside, something shattered. Even the sparrow has found a home. A place near your altar, O Lord Almighty. That night, the barriers returned. Kaio was placed in his old enclosure, Savannah in hers. The distance between them, physical, emotional, spiritual, yawned open like a wound torn fresh. Kaio didn't understand? He cried, not with pain but confusion. Sharp, stinging cries that rang through the halls. He pressed his paws against the divider, searching. And when he found nothing, he curled against the gate, unmoving, eyes wide with the kind of stillness that breaks hearts. Savannah didn't eat, didn't rest. She didn't rage like before. This wasn't that. This was grief. She circled, stopped, circled again. Stared at the empty gate as if willing him into existence. The staff watched with heavy hearts. They had seen what this bond had become, real, restorative, and now, ripped apart by policies and paperwork, the light that had returned to both was beginning to dim. They filed appeals, called contacts, reached out to conservation alliances and nonprofit donors. And one desperate call landed with a wildlife advocacy program partially funded by Patagonia. He lifts the poor from the dust and the needy from the ash heap. The response was swift. Funding was secured. A new future mapped. Kaio would be transferred to a licensed big cat sanctuary in Colorado, one that specialized in exotic wildlife saved from black market horrors. There he would have space, safety, a new beginning, but he would not have Savannah. The news settled. Like frost across the teams' faces. They walked slower. Volunteers lingered longer at the viewing windows. That night, Kaio was brought back to her, one last time. No glass, no chains, no staff inside the room, just them. He saw her and ran. She lowered her head, and he pressed into her chest, burying himself in her fur like a heartbeat remembering where it belonged. She curled around him, tongue sweeping over his back, his ears, his tiny shoulders. They didn't move for an hour. The only sound was breath, too wild. Lungs inhaling one another. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. Morning came. The van idled outside. The crate waited. Soft towels, heated pads. Kaio was curious. He sniffed the edges, tilted his head. There was no fear in him. Not yet, just expectation, because surely she would be there. She always was. But Savannah hadn't been brought in. Not yet. The staff debated. Some said goodbye would only deepen the wound. Others knew the truth. Love that deep deserves a goodbye. Savannah had been pacing the fence since dawn. She knew. The voices, the scent of departure in the air. When they opened the gate and brought him to her, she didn't run. She waited. He saw her and chirped, a sound just for her, then pressed himself against her side. She bent around him, body curling, chin resting along his spine. Stillness, silence, then came the whisper. Kaio, a soft call from the vet. He looked up, blinked, then turned back toward Savannah like a question. She didn't move, but she tightened her hold for one more second. And then, slowly, released. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Kaio was lifted gently into the crate. He didn't cry. He watched, silent, still. Savannah stepped forward and pressed her nose to the edge, one breath, one pause, then the doors closed. The van pulled away, tires whispering over frost-kissed gravel. Savannah stood at the gate long after it disappeared down the road. She didn't wail, didn't rage, she just watched. When night fell, she turned away. There was weight in her posture now, yes, but not hollowness. Not that emptiness that used to echo inside her, because she hadn't been abandoned. Not this time. She had been chosen, she had been needed. She had been loved. And though the scars on her legs still told the story of pain, The light in her eyes told another story entirely. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Savannah was released back into the wild weeks later. Northern New Mexico, where the sky stretches like forgiveness and the wind carries memory. She limps, yes, but every step is her own. She hunts again. She claims ground again. She is not the same. She is more. And Kaio? He lives in the foothills of Colorado now, a sanctuary where the broken find peace, where survivors of greed and cruelty are given space to become nothing more and nothing less than animals again. Sometimes he chirps into the stillness at night. Sometimes he curls in on himself as he sleeps, but he is safe. He is loved, and when he dreams of warmth, of fur, of the space beneath a wild heartbeat where he once belonged, the righteous care for the needs of their animals. This is more than a touching animal story, more than dramatic wildlife rescue, more than heartwarming animal video or viral YouTube story. This is a soul-deep reminder that animal rescue is not about cages and treatment charts, it's about connection. And sometimes the most broken among us are the only ones who can reach each other. Here at Hope and Fur, we believe in that truth, that every animal has a story, that every story is a lifeline, that human and animal connection is not just 'cause it's a calling. Share this, let it breathe. Because someone out there, human or animal, is still waiting to be seen, to be chosen, to be saved.